Hey guys, welcome back to the land of books, movies, and acupuncture. This week I am steering out of my own lane and into some true crime territory. The book is called Anne Perry and the Murder of the Century, which at first glance sounds pretty vague. But this is one that I went for when I this is the book that I went for when I went on a search for the story that inspired the movie that put Peter Jackson, Kate Winslet, and Melanie Lynskey on the map in 1994. It is Heavenly Creatures. In case you haven't heard or seen or heard of this one, and you're just sitting there, tying yourself in knots wondering, who is this Anne Perry, and what did she have to do with a murder of the century? And which one are we talking about anyway? Is it O.J. Simpson? Is it Scott Peterson? Is it Casey Anthony? And the answer to the first is that Anne Perry is a world-renowned, best-selling murder mystery novelist. The answer to the second is that she was part of it when she was just a child. And the answer to the third is none of the above. It's the murder trial of Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume, who is now Anne Perry, for the murder of Honora Parker. Before we get to the book and movie conversation, let me clue you in on why. All right. Imagine, if you will, a fantasy land created in your own mind and shared with another mind that is so rich, colorful, and full to capacity with enjoyment that leaving your imagination and this fantasy land to return to your everyday life of routine obligations becomes increasingly insufferable and unbearable. And the more time spent with this special someone in this shared fantasy land, the more bleak everyday life looks, and the more tiresome everyone else becomes. Imagine being addicted to this fantasy land and the person you share it with. So much so that psychological intervention has been attempted, and it's gotten to the point where external forces threaten this connection in and out of this shared and addictive fantasy. And this threat of separation from this person and removal from this mental sanctuary seriously inspires a feeling of desperation, and where it's either lose all this internalized joy or remove the threat to it. That's exactly what happened here. Okay, the book and movie start in the same place, with a little briefing on the city of Christchurch in New Zealand, with an overlapping of the two girls running for help, screaming and covered in blood. The book starts the next couple of chapters on the histories of both the girls' parents and the early childhoods of both girls. None of which is really central to the story, so it's left out of the movie for as much as it is irrelevant. The one detail that Pauline's parents never really legally married crept up in the end of the movie to avoid confusing the viewers about the discrepancy in last names. More on that later. There's also the brief mention about the childhood diseases both girls dealt with that served as catalysts for them being both quite lonery before they met. And when they met, and how quickly they hit it off over shared interests in the arts and shared talent for writing and shared imaginations that really ran deep. The book merely discusses the details of their invented stories and their internal world, where they were Gina and Deborah instead of Pauline and Juliet. The movie shows us this wondrous land where all their imagined friends and heroes danced and drank and lived a life of revelry that really did make their routine life seem incredibly dull by comparison. They also wrote poetry and had long sleepover weekends. It is only in the movie that their friendship took a turn towards romantic attachment that troubled Pauline's mother during the bleak days when swinging that way was called a mental illness. In the book, it is only speculated that they swung that way based on the contents of their writing and that they lacked inhibition taking baths together and taking nude pictures of each other. There's also some jealousy shown on Juliet's part in different ways from book to movie when Pauline had a brief fling with one of the boarders her parents took in. And the pitched battle between Pauline and her mother is also same from book to movie. And when Juliet's recurrent respiratory problems called for a move to a warmer location. In the book, Juliet's parents were amenable to taking Pauline with them. But in both, Pauline's parents were dead set against it. And that is when this threat to their connection, both in and out of their rich fantasy, and all their plans and dreams to travel together, write books, and star in movies, hit fever pitch, and they plotted and carried out the murder of Honora while on a nature walk. The murder is described in gory detail what each girl did to Honora to make sure she did not survive the attack, and that it looked as much like an accident as possible under the circumstances. Both the book and the movie include the use of that pink gemstone as a decoy before the attack. And the book describes the injuries and crime scene in forensic detail, and the movie gives us a climactic moment that is barely watchable. Without showing the damage dealt, the background goes silent as the weapon is drawn. The first killer hesitates for just a second, then the first blow is struck, drawing an agonized and stunned groan from the victim. The scene quickly cuts back and forth to an imagined tragedy of best friends being separated forever, and does this repeatedly as it cuts from each girl swinging this blood-soaked makeshift flail at their defenseless victim back to their heart-wrenching separation. And the movie ends on a very sad note, that they were tried and convicted for murder, were sentenced according to their age, and as a condition of their release, they were never to meet again. In the book, that condition was not true. A little sad dramatic effect in the movie. What is only in the book is a lot of history about both families, and not a lot of nice things said about them. Herbert Reaper, Pauline's father, left a wife and 2 young sons for Honora when he held a more lucrative career and she was his young secretary. They had one more child after Pauline, who had Down syndrome, that they checked into what used to be called a group home for imbeciles and visited her once a week. And Herbert, brought in an income working as a fishmonger, and Honora supplemented their income by renting out extra bedrooms to boarders. And they kept all their assets in her name, so he could always duck any attempts by his former wife to collect alimony and child support. They were never formally divorced, so he and Honora were never formally married, which doubled the scandal in Christchurch at the time of the murder. Juliet's parents were very well educated, and her father held some pretty lofty positions in education and government. Her mother was a marriage counselor who also contributed to a radio show, kind of like a podcast, dedicated to the subject. And she was also a little bit of a hypocrite, since she cheated on her husband often, even with a patient that she ended up marrying. However, she was also a little bit ahead of her time, since she was open to talking about the salacious elements of marriage, and didn't bat an eye at the speculation that Juliet and Pauline were more than friends. Also, only in the book, the arrest and trial of Pauline and Juliet was very much a big deal in New Zealand, and both girls basked in the attention. After the conviction, they were sent to separate prisons, and considered to be the instigator and brains behind the outfit, Juliet was sent to the harsher prison, whose described conditions conjure up an image of the Chateau d'If from Count of Monte Cristo. and Pauline was sent to a slightly less dungeony one. It is while incarcerated that both girls finished and expanded their educations, received therapy, and learned marketable skills. After release, Pauline took a few office jobs, even tried to join a convent, but ultimately settled into a career as a librarian with a side gig in equestrianism. Juliet developed a real knack for tailoring and dressmaking, but her ultimate passion was writing. After she was released, she changed her name. She's been Anne Perry since then, and her murder mystery novels have sold well into the millions. Neither one of them either reached out to reestablish contact for no other reason than lack of interest. And that was a long-winded one, and all there is about heavenly creatures and Anne Perry and the murder mystery, the murder of the century. And please help me, keep on keeping on with your likes, comments, subscribes, shares, and check out my sponsor in the description. And as always, thank you so much for watching.